Jacob had been craving solitude. City life had worn him thin, and the prospect of a quiet weekend deep in the woods was too tempting to pass up. He found a listing online for a rustic cabin miles from civilization, a Wi-Fi, no cell service, just the sound of the trees and the occasional rustle of wildlife. Perfect. The cabin was smaller than he'd imagined, but cozy in a rugged way. It had a creaky wooden floor, a stone fireplace, and the faint, earthy smell of age. He dropped his bag by the door, made a mental note to sweep out the cobwebs later, and set to unpacking. The first night passed uneventfully. Jacob read by candlelight, lulled by the crackling of the fire and the chorus of crickets outside. The isolation was soothing, just as he'd hoped. But as the morning sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, Jacob decided to explore the cabin more thoroughly. It was during this inspection that he noticed one of the floorboards in the living room was loose. Curiosity got the better of him. With a bit of effort, he pried the board up and found a leather-bound diary nestled in the hollow beneath. The leather was cracked, the edges frayed, and the pages yellowed with age. The name on the inside cover read, Miriam H. Jacob flipped through the diary's pages. The entries began innocently enough, chronicling mundane details of life in the cabin, the changing seasons, the wildlife, the solitude. But as he read on, the tone shifted. Miriam's descriptions became darker, more frantic. She wrote of footsteps echoing through the cabin at night, of whispered voices just outside the windows, of shadowy figures she could never quite catch sight of. One entry in particular made Jacob pause. The 3rd of June? I heard it again last night. The sound of someone walking upstairs. But there is no upstairs. There never was. Jacob glanced upward instinctively. The cabin's ceiling was low and solid. There wasn't even an attic. A shiver ran down his spine, but he shook it off. It was just a story, he told himself. Miriam had probably been isolated for too long and let her imagination run wild. That night, the cabin felt different. The once comforting silence now seemed oppressive, the shadows cast by the firelight sharper and more menacing. As Jacob lay in bed, he thought he heard faint creaks in the floorboards, as if someone was walking in the next room. But when he got up to check, the cabin was empty. The next morning, Jacob's unease deepened as he read further into the diary. Miriam's entries became more erratic. She described waking up with scratches on her arms, finding objects moved from where she'd left them, and hearing her name whispered in the dead of night. One entry chilled him to the core. The 7th of July. It knows my name. I saw it today, in the mirror. It wasn't me. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. That evening, as he sat by the fire, he noticed something strange. The shadows on the walls didn't move in time with the flickering flames. They seemed to have a life of their own, writhing and stretching unnaturally. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the unease gnawed at him. The 3rd night was the worst. As Jacob lay in bed, he was jolted awake by a loud bang. Heart pounding, he grabbed the flashlight from his bedside table and crept into the living room. The loose floorboard was sticking up, as if someone had pried it open again. The diary was lying on top, open to a page he hadn't read yet. The entry was dated the 10th of July, and it described an encounter that mirrored his own. The bang, the floorboard, the flashlight. And then he saw it. His name, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Jacob, it's coming for you. A cold dread settled over him. He slammed the diary shut and threw it back under the floorboard, replacing the plank as best he could. But the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. He felt eyes on him everywhere he turned. Every creak, every rustle, every gust of wind outside made him jump. At midnight, Jacob's flashlight began to flicker. He scrambled to replace the batteries, but the beam wouldn't steady. That's when he heard it, a low guttural growl coming from the corner of the room. Slowly, he turned the beam of the flashlight in that direction. The shadows seemed to deepen, coalescing into a shape that defied logic, impossibly thin, with limbs that stretched unnaturally. Jacob backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. The thing moved closer, its form shifting and flickering like a bad signal on a television screen. Just as it reached for him, the flashlight died completely, plunging the room into darkness. The next thing Jacob knew, he was outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. He didn't remember running out, but his legs ached as if he'd sprinted a mile. The cabin loomed behind him, its windows dark and foreboding. He clutched the diary in his hands, though he had no memory of retrieving it. Desperate for answers, he flipped to the last page. The date was today's, and the entry read, the 21st of January. It's already too late. Run. As Jacob read the final words, the cabin door creaked open behind him, though no wind stirred the trees. The shadows inside seemed to pulse, beckoning him back. And then he heard it, a whisper, clear as day, right next to his ear. Jacob, it's too late to run. The first time Nathan saw the figure outside his window, he chalked it up to exhaustion. The cabin was miles away from the nearest town, tucked deep into the shadowy embrace of the woods. It was supposed to be his retreat, a place to write, to think, to escape. But as the moonlight cast long, gnarled shadows across the clearing, Nathan couldn't shake the sense that he wasn't alone. It began subtly. A flicker of motion caught in his peripheral vision as he hunched over his desk. He glanced up, expecting to see a deer or perhaps a branch swaying in the wind. Instead, there it was, a silhouette standing just outside the window, its shape warped by the old, rippled glass. Whoever it was stood unnervingly still, as though carved from the darkness itself. Nathan froze, the pen slipping from his hand. His throat tightened. For a moment, he considered calling out, but something about the figure, its stillness, its vague but undeniably human, chaperoned him to his chair. Instead, he reached for the small desk lamp and flicked it on. Instantly, the figure vanished. Not a retreat, not a hurried escape into the trees. It simply wasn't there anymore. He spent the rest of the night pacing the cabin, every creak of the floorboards setting his nerves alight. By morning, the incident felt like a bad dream, a trick of the moonlight and his overactive imagination. But the next night, it happened again. This time, he was ready. The figure appeared shortly after sunset, as Nathan sat pretending to read. He'd left the curtains open, daring it to show itself. When it did, standing in the exact same spot, he felt the same icy dread crawl up his spine, but he forced himself to act. Clutching a flashlight, he bolted out the front door, his boots crunching against the frosty ground. The beam of light sliced through the darkness as he circled the cabin. There was no one there. No footprints in the dirt, no rustling of bushes, nothing. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. The woods swallowed his words, offering no reply. When he returned inside, the window was still empty, but he felt eyes on him, sharp, invisible, relentless. By the third night, Nathan couldn't ignore the pattern. The figure appeared like clockwork, always at the same window, always vanishing the moment he turned on the light. He stopped sleeping, his nights spent in a state of hyper-alertness, waiting for it to return. The strain began to wear on him. His reflection in the mirror was hollow-eyed, his hands trembling even when he held nothing. One evening, desperate for answers, he set up an old camcorder on the desk, its lens trained on the window. If the figure showed itself again, he'd finally have proof. Hours ticked by as he sat in silence, the only sounds the occasional pop of the wood stove and the wind's mournful whistle. Then it came. The figure materialized slowly this time, as though it were seeping out of the shadows. Nathan watched it through the viewfinder, his breath shallow. He resisted the urge to turn on the light, wanting the camera to capture every second. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if it knew it was being watched. Suddenly, the camcorder's screen went black. Nathan's heart plummeted. He scrambled to check the device, but it wouldn't power back on. When he glanced back at the window, the figure was gone. The sense of intrusion lingered, thuff of pressure in the air, like static before a storm. The following day, Nathan played back the tape on an old television. At first, it seemed normal, the empty clearing outside the cabin, the soft glow of moonlight, and then the figure appeared. But what the tape showed wasn't what he'd seen with his own eyes. On the recording, the figure was pressed against the glass, its face pale and grotesquely stretched. Its mouth gaped open, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. Nathan recoiled, nearly knocking over the television. He could hear it now too, faint but unmistakable rasping, wet sound, like breathing mixed with something far more sinister. He destroyed the tape that afternoon, burning it in the wood stove until only ashes remained. But the figure didn't care. It came back that night, closer than ever. When Nathan finally turned on the light, he swore he saw the faint outline of a handprint smeared on the glass. Over the next few days, the incidents escalated. The figure didn't wait for nightfall anymore. It appeared at odd hours, always at the periphery of his vision. Objects in the cabin moved on their own, books tumbling off shelves, chairs creaking as though unseen weight pressed on them. Once, as he tried to sleep, he felt a cold breath against his neck. He didn't dare turn around. By the end of the week, Nathan decided he'd had enough. He packed his belongings in a frenzy, ready to abandon the cabin for good. But as he reached the front door, he heard a slow, deliberate knock. His blood ran cold. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound, as if nails were being dragged down the wood. Nathan's hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. Finally, he wrenched it open. The clearing was empty. The wind hissed through the trees, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. He stepped outside cautiously, scanning the darkness. That's when he felt Ida hand, icy and impossibly strong, gripping his shoulder from behind. Nathan never made it out of the woods. The locals would later whisper about the cabin, about the man who'd come to escape, and was instead consumed. On certain nights, if you stand by the tree line and peer into the clearing, you might see him at the window, his silhouette warped by the old rippled glass. The rain started as a light drizzle but quickly turned into a relentless downpour, drumming against the roof of the cabin with a deafening rhythm. James, a 30-something city dweller with a constant itch to escape the monotony of his desk job, had booked the cabin through a travel app that promised solitude and serenity. Nestled deep within a forest 2 hours from the nearest town, it seemed like the perfect retreat, cheap, cozy, and surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. The first day had been uneventful. James spent most of it lounging on the worn-out couch, nursing a bottle of wine while flipping through a novel he'd brought along but wasn't truly interested in reading. By the time evening rolled around, the cabin's rustic charm had begun to feel more like isolation. The dim, flickering bulbs barely lit the small living space, and the occasional groan of the wooden floorboards beneath his feet felt unsettling. Still, he told himself it was all part of the experience. That first night, James fell asleep to the sound of rain, thinking the forest darkness was a comfortable break from the city lights and noise. But just as he began to drift off, he heard it. A knock. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible over the rain. But there it was again. A deliberate, steady knock against the wall. He sat up, heart pounding. "It's probably just a branch," he muttered, trying to dismiss the sound. But when he strained his ears, he realized the knocking wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the wall. A chill crept up his spine, but he shook it off, laughing nervously. "You are just being paranoid," he told himself. "It's an old cabin. It's probably settling or something." Still, he couldn't shake the unease. He grabbed his phone and texted the cabin's owner, a woman named Margaret, who'd been polite but distant during their brief correspondence. "Hey, I'm hearing some weird noises in the wall. Could it be animals?" he typed, hitting send. A response came almost immediately. "Probably raccoons or squirrels. The forest is full of them. Don't worry, they won't get inside. Just ignore it." James stared at the message, her casual reassurance doing little to calm his nerves. Still, he forced himself to relax, turning the television on to drown out the noise. The static-filled channels and crackling audio were hardly soothing, but it was better than the alternative. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him, and he fell asleep on the couch, the remote slipping from his hand. The second night was worse. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest unnervingly quiet. Around midnight, the knocking began again, louder this time. James sat bolt upright, his skin prickling with fear. It wasn't just knocking anymore. It was accompanied by a faint scraping, as if something was clawing at the wall. He grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and shone it around the room, his pulse hammering in his ears. Okay, maybe it is animals, he muttered, though he didn't entirely believe it. The sounds were too deliberate, too human. He texted Margaret again. The noises are louder tonight. Are you sure it's animals? This time her response was slower. Yes, it's just animals. These old cabins always make weird sounds. Try not to worry. Something about her reply didn't sit right with him. The smiley face from the previous message was gone, and the tone felt more clipped. But he didn't know what else to do. He spent the rest of the night huddled under the blanket, flashlight in hand, waiting for morning. By the third night, James was on edge. The unease he'd felt before had grown into a gnawing paranoia. The knocking began earlier, just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees. It was no longer confined to one spot. Now it seemed to move along the walls, as if something was crawling inside. He couldn't take it anymore. Determined to get to the bottom of the noise, James grabbed a hammer from the small toolbox he'd found in a cupboard and began tapping on the walls. The sound reverberated through the cabin, but when he reached the spot where the knocking was loudest, the hollow thud beneath his hammer made him freeze. It didn't sound like the rest of the wall. It sounded off, different. Heart racing, he began prying away at the wooden paneling. It was tough work, and each nail he pulled out seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he managed to remove a large section of the wall. Behind it was another wall, hastily constructed and poorly sealed. A chill draft seeped through the cracks, and James realized that this section of the cabin had been deliberately walled off. He hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to stop, but curiosity got the better of him. He broke through the second wall, revealing a hidden room cloaked in darkness. The air that rushed out was thick, damp, and reeked of decay. Shining his flashlight inside, he saw a small, barren space with nothing but a wooden chair in the center. The chair faced the wall, its back to the room, and ropes dangled from the armrests as if someone had been tied to it. James stepped back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "What the hell?" he whispered. Just as he turned to leave, the door to the room slammed shut behind him. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. And then he heard it not from the walls, but from directly behind him. A deep, guttural whisper. Finally, before James could react, cold fingers brushed against his shoulder, sending a jolt of terror through his body. He spun around, the flashlight flickering back to life just long enough to illuminate a figure twisted, emaciated, and impossibly tall. Its eyes were hollow voids, yet they seemed to bore into him with an unbearable intensity. The figure lunged, and James screamed, stumbling backward into the chair. As he hit the ground, the ropes on the armrests writhed like living things, snapping around his wrists and pinning him down. The creature loomed over him, its face inches from his own. Its breath was rancid, and its voice came again, a guttural rasp filled with malice. "You woke me. Now you stay." James thrashed against the restraints, but the ropes only tightened. The last thing he saw before the flashlight died for good was the creature's mouth splitting into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Then, the room plunged into complete darkness, and James's screams were swallowed by the silence of the forest. The next morning, the cabin stood silent and undisturbed. The walls showed no sign of being tampered with, and the hidden room was sealed once more. When Margaret arrived to prepare the cabin for the next guest, she noticed nothing out of place except for the faint, lingering smell of decay that seemed to cling to the air, no matter how wide she opened the windows. The cabin stood alone in the heart of the forest, its dark wooden exterior blending seamlessly with the towering trees that surrounded it. Emma and Ryan, a young couple eager for a weekend escape from the city, had rented the place on a whim. It was charming in its own rustic way, with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a single bedroom with creaky floorboards that whispered of countless years of history. But as night fell, the forest's serenity gave way to an unsettling stillness that seemed to press against the windows. The first sign of something unusual came shortly after midnight. Emma was curled up on the couch, a book in her hands, while Ryan poked at the fireplace, trying to coax the flames higher. A faint murmur broke the quiet, so soft Emma thought she'd imagined it. "Did you hear that?" she asked, lowering her book. Ryan glanced up. "Hear what?" "A voice?" she said hesitantly. "It sounded like it was coming from under the floor." Ryan laughed, the sound a bit too loud in the otherwise silent room. "It's probably just the wind, or maybe the cabin settling. These old places make all kinds of weird noises." But Emma wasn't convinced. She sat frozen, straining to hear. And then it came again, clearer this time, a faint, whispered sound, like someone speaking just out of earshot. Ryan's smile faltered. "Okay," he said, setting down the poker. "That's weird. Maybe it's an animal." They both crouched low, their ears to the floor. The whispers were clearer now, and undeniably human. Words they couldn't quite make out floated up through the wooden planks, joined by a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across a hard surface. Emma recoiled, her face pale. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. Ryan didn't answer. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the old iron ring embedded in the floor near the fireplace. It was the handle of a hatch, one they hadn't paid much attention to when they'd first arrived. Now, it seemed ominous, almost alive. "I am going to open it," Ryan said, his voice low. Emma grabbed his arm. "No, are you crazy? We don't know what's down there." "Exactly," he said, shaking her off. "We don't know, and I'd rather find out now than spend the whole night wondering." Reluctantly, Emma stepped back, her heart pounding as Ryan gripped the handle and pulled. The hatch creaked open, revealing a yawning blackness below. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the space. It was a cellar, empty save for a dirt floor littered with handprints and footprints. They were human, but oddly shaped, with fingers and toes that seemed unnaturally long. "There's nothing here," Ryan said, his voice echoing slightly. "Just prints. Maybe someone was squatting here before us." "Those aren't normal footprints," Emma said, her voice trembling. "Let's just close it and forget about it, okay?" Ryan hesitated but nodded, pulling the hatch shut. They bolted it and returned to the couch, trying to convince themselves it was nothing. But the whispers returned, louder now, their words just barely discernible. "Let us out," they seemed to say. The floorboards began to vibrate, a low, rhythmic thumping joining the voices. Emma clung to Ryan, her nails digging into his arm. "We need to leave," she said, her voice barely audible over the noise. Ryan grabbed his car keys, and they ran to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The knob refused to turn, as if some unseen force was holding it in place. The windows were the same, their glass cold and unyielding no matter how hard they pounded. The thumping grew louder, shaking the entire cabin. The hatch rattled violently, the iron ring clanging against the wood. Emma screamed as a crack split the floor, and from the darkness below, pale, elongated fingers began to emerge. Ryan grabbed the fire poker and swung at the hand, but it moved with unnatural speed, dodging the blow. More hands appeared, followed by arms and faces twisted, eyeless things with gaping mouths that emitted an unearthly wail. Emma and Ryan backed into a corner, their horror mounting as the creatures pulled themselves up and out of the hatch. "Stay back!" Ryan shouted, swinging the poker wildly. But the creatures didn't seem to notice him. They moved in unison, their heads tilting as if listening to something only they could hear. And then they spoke, their voices overlapping in a chilling harmony. "You woke us. You opened the way," Emma sobbed, clutching Ryan as the creatures turned toward them, their movements jerky and unnatural. The couple's screams echoed through the forest as the creatures closed in, their long fingers reaching out. When morning came, the cabin was silent. The hatch was closed, the bolts secured as if it had never been touched. A new couple arrived that afternoon, eager for a peaceful getaway. They didn't notice the faint, ghostly handprints on the floorboards, or the way the air seemed heavier inside. But as night fell, the whispers began again, soft and inviting, luring them closer to the hatch in the floor. The dense forest swallowed the fading daylight as a group of 5 teenagers trudged through the undergrowth, their flashlights flickering against the looming shadows. They'd heard the rumors, the legend of the old forest rangers who tanned, fueled by youthful bravado, decided to uncover the truth for themselves. The hut, they were told, was cursed, its walls bearing sinister inscriptions, left by a ranger who vanished decades ago under mysterious circumstances. "Do you think we'll find anything?" asked Mia, her voice trembling slightly. Her flashlight beam darted nervously across the gnarled trees. "Just some old junk and maybe a couple of rats?" scoffed Jake, the self-proclaimed leader of the group. His confidence was unwavering, even as the forest seemed to press in around them. "Yeah, or a ghost waiting to eat our faces," muttered Ethan, earning a nervous laugh from Ava and Liam. But deep down, all 5 felt the weight of an unseen presence, a suffocating tension that thickened the air with every step. Finally, they reached it. The hut stood in a small clearing, its crooked roof sagging under the weight of time. The wood was warped and blackened, as if the building had been scorched by an unseen fire. Vines snaked up its sides, clawing at the cracked windows. "Looks like it's about to fall over," Jake said, masking his unease. He pushed the creaking door open with a dramatic flourish. "After you, ladies and gentlemen." The group stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The interior was as unsettling as the exterior. Cobwebs draped every corner, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. But it was the walls that drew their attention. Words had been scrawled across them in jagged, uneven letters, as if carved by a desperate hand. "I am watching you. You are next." Mia shivered, instinctively stepping closer to Ava. "This is seriously messed up. Who would do this?" "It's probably just some old graffiti," Jake said, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. He ran a hand over one of the carvings, the letters rough and deep. Or maybe the ranger was just a psycho. "Guys, look at this," Ethan called out. He was standing by an old dust-covered table. On it lay a tattered notebook, its pages filled with frantic scribbles and crude drawings of faces contorted in terror. "This is like something out of a horror movie," Liam said, flipping through the pages. "Did he draw these people? Were they real?" Suddenly, a sharp noise broke the silence. A loud creak, as if someone had stepped on a loose floorboard. All 5 froze, their flashlights whipping toward the sound. There was nothing there. "Probably just the wind," Jake muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. As they explored further, the unsettling atmosphere only deepened. Strange symbols adorned the walls, and the air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. The group's banter grew quieter, their nerves fraying with each passing minute. Then it happened. One moment, Ethan was standing near the far wall, examining a particularly large inscription. The next, he was gone. No sound, no scream, just gone. "Ethan?" Mia's voice cracked as she spun around, her flashlight searching desperately. "This isn't funny. Where are you?" "He's messing with us," Jake said, though his hands were shaking. "He'll jump out any second, just wait." But Ethan didn't jump out. Instead, the wall where he'd been standing began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new image appeared, a drawing of Ethan's face, his eyes wide with terror, mouth frozen in a silent scream. Ava screamed, dropping her flashlight. "Oh my God, that's him! That's Ethan!" The others stared in horror, unable to look away from the grotesque likeness. It was unmistakable, the same curly hair, the same faint scar on his cheek. But it wasn't just a drawing. It felt alive, as if Ethan's essence had been trapped within the wall. "We need to get out of here," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. "Right now." But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The flashlights flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance and writhe. A low, guttural sound filled the hut, like the growl of some unseen predator. "Stay together," Jake ordered, his voice trembling. He tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. "Help me with this." Liam and Ava rushed to his side, pulling and pounding on the door, but it remained firmly shut. Meanwhile, Mia's flashlight caught something new on the wall. Another inscription, fresh and dripping as if it had just been carved. "Leave if you can." "We're trapped," Mia said, her eyes wide with panic. "It won't let us go." Suddenly, Liam let out a strangled cry. The group turned to see him clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain. Before anyone could react, he vanished just like Ethan. In his place, another drawing appeared, this one even more horrifying. It showed Liam's face, his mouth twisted in an anguished scream, tears streaming down his cheeks. The remaining three huddled together, their fear palpable. The air grew colder, each breath visible in the dim light. The growling sound intensified, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "What does it want?" Ava whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," Jake admitted, his confidence shattered. "But we're not staying to find out. We'll break a window if we have to." But as they moved toward the nearest window, the glass darkened, as if ink was spreading across it. The walls seemed to close in, the room growing smaller and smaller. And then Ava was gone, her scream echoing for just a moment before it was swallowed by the darkness. Her likeness appeared on the wall, her eyes pleading for help. "No, no, no," Mia sobbed, clutching Jake's arm. "We can't stay here, we have to do something." "There's nothing we can do," Jake said, his voice hollow. "It's playing with us." The growling turned to laughter deep, guttural and mocking. Jake grabbed a piece of broken wood, brandishing it like a weapon. "Come out and face me," he yelled, but the laughter only grew louder. In a final desperate act, Jake smashed the wood against the wall, shouting in defiance. The wall splintered slightly, but the darkness surged forward, engulfing him. Mia screamed as his image appeared next, his expression one of sheer agony. Now alone, Mia backed into a corner, her flashlight flickering. The laughter ceased, replaced by silence so profound it was deafening. Slowly, the darkness crept toward her, tendrils reaching out like living shadows. On the wall, new words appeared. "Welcome home." And then, there was only darkness.